So today, colleagues, we're going to be having an introductory session to the new international ISO safety standards. The first one is the ISO 35001 that was released in 2019, and this is specifically looking at biorisk management for laboratories and other related organizations. And the second one is the one we're more familiar with, ISO 15190, which was released earlier this year. I guess you along with me, we've been waiting on the release of these standards, both of them a long time overdue. And so again, I want to say that this is really an introduction, and we will not be able to go into the level of detail in some of the clauses. And so that's the type of feedback that I would be looking for from you in terms of following this session. What are some of the areas or clauses of each of the standards that you think we can work on together in depth to help you to not only understand what the standards are asking for, but also what it means in terms of actioning the clauses and the requirements. So thank you for agreeing and being present to be part of the first or initial session. What we'll try to do is also make this recording available afterwards if you would like to go back. So by way of an introduction and a background, we know that the ISO 15190 for medical laboratories requirements for safety, we know of it from 2003, so that's 17 years since we had the last version available to us. And since that time, there've been new technologies. There's been a shift towards a more risk-based approach as opposed to a one-size-fits-all approach. We know more now. We are learning every day. And so a lot of the members of the technical committee recognize that the standards can't be written only for those that already have, the regulatory systems in place and that national oversight and frameworks, but it's really meant to be used at a global level. And so that's why I've really been moving towards more of the local risk assessment and local risk-based approach. Additionally, in this new version, there is more of a recognition of the human element. That is some of the clauses related to the laboratory safety management and how we deal with employees. I just asked the host, I'm not sure if it's Feriel or Simone, to mute persons in the meantime, thanks, and just asking persons to be aware of that. Thank you. And the second standard that we're going to be looking at is the ISO 35001 from 2019. That's the biorisk management for laboratories and other related organizations. Many of you would have been part of trainings with me, and I would have spoken about this particular standard and saying, yes, it's going to become a standard. And I would have been referring to it at the time as the CWA 15793 document on biorisk management. Now, what's interesting is that the CWA document is freely available, but as we know, ISO standards are not. It's very, very closely matched. If you're not in a position to purchase the standard, the 35001 standard as yet, I believe many of you who've done the trainings with me would have a copy of the CWA standard, but again, it's freely available if you want to look at it. And the clauses might be rearranged a little bit, but by and large, the text has remained the same. And of course, over the years, we've spoken about it. Since 2014, there was a recommendation for this CWA document to become an ISO standard. Now it has, and it uses the Plan, Do, Check, Act model and a management system approach. So there are similarities and there are differences between these two standards. And I just have a note at the bottom here to say that The technical committee that was responsible for the development of the ISO 15190 is the same group of persons for the 35001, and that's the ISO TC 212 group. They're the clinical laboratory testing and in vitro diagnostic test systems technical committee. And as national focal points for laboratory biosafety and biosecurity and safety officers, if you do have an interest in being part of the development of standards like these, you can actually reach out to your local Bureau of Standards and let them know as well. And of course, we would be willing to support your request to be part of the process. I wanted to give you a note about other international biosafety guidance before we launched into the two international standards. Many of you might be familiar with the graphics on the left-hand side, showing the Laboratory Biosafety Manual from WHO, the Canadian Biosafety Guidance from 2014, and of course, now we're talking about the two new standards. At this point in time, we still expect WHO to release the fourth edition of the Laboratory Biosafety Manual. Again, there will be less emphasis on biosafety levels and risk groups, and more focus on local risk assessment in the new guidance document. Also, in terms of the way in which the mitigation prevention measures would be collated or presented in WHO, LBM would be using core requirements, which we're very familiar with. The biosafety levels would be looking at those requirements for biosafety level 1 and level 2. Heightened control measures, which more relate to the BSL-3 requirements that we're familiar with, and maximum containment measures, which are related to all the different engineering, administrative, PPE measures related with working in what is known as a maximum containment facility, or BSL-4. In the meantime, what you can do, and this document has been shared with everyone, WHO has actually provided what the core requirements are in the laboratory biosafety guidance related to coronavirus disease. And the last updated version of that was in May 2020. So if you want to go back and take a look at that particular document, you'll actually see that they've listed what the core requirements are. That's going to be in the fourth edition. Additionally, they have, as part of that document, a risk assessment form that you can use. Of course, I would promote the use of CARFA's risk assessment procedure and form that many of you are familiar with now, because I think ours really covers not only the biosafety aspects, but safety in general, which is what the 15190 standard really asks us to do. So you have everything there, and simply you just delete or you just tick off not applicable. So you've considered all these aspects when you're doing your risk assessment. However, what I want to say is that the CDC, US CDC, has issued its sixth edition biosafety in microbiological and biomedical laboratories, the BMBL, that many of us are familiar with. And that's the link if you want to download the BMBL, the new edition. However, in looking at this document, they have still retained the approach of the risk groups as well as the biosafety levels. So in reading it, it's very good information also as a reference document. But I would use it in connection or collaboration with these other documents, so that you're not locking yourself in as well. New approach is really risk assessment, the risk-based approach. And yes, the new version of the BMBL does look at that, but it's very specific to the different agents, and that's what makes it really useful when you're doing your risk assessment as well. Remember, it will be up to you, the laboratory safety officer and the NFP, to really guide the process of what measures you recommend to be put in place or that are maintained as part of the safety program. So there's really that shift now away from designating a lab as BSL-2 or BSL-3, simply because labs we have different methodologies that we're using, and at the drop of a hat, as we know, some of our labs may have been designated only BSL-1, in fact. And now we've been asked to do testing for COVID-19, which at the time would have required extra requirements. And so using the risk-based approach allows a lab like that to actually safely and securely do the work that's required using that risk-based approach and enabling them to implement the different measures that are required. So what is our goal at the end of all of this? I think I speak for all of us when I say we want to have sustainable, relevant quality management systems in place in our labs and at a national level to be able to meet whatever applicable requirements we have at the national, regional, and international level against these various standards. And I don't only have the ISO 15190 or the ISO 35001 standards there, but I have the ISO 15189-2012 standard included in that loop. Because as we know, we have the what and the how. And how we work safely and securely supports what we do as part of our quality management system. In terms of the complementarity of these two standards that we're talking about today, I want to say that the 35001 really takes a strategic approach to biosafety and biosecurity, to biorisk management. It's a management systems approach. There are 10 clauses in this particular standard, and we're going to go through these: leadership, planning, support, operation, performance evaluation, and improvement. And clearly you see that's more a high level type sections or components that we're looking at, but they fit nicely with the ISO 15190 standard, which takes more of an operational approach, which we're familiar with the previous version. But now it has 19 clauses, and some of the newer or more in-depth clauses that they present in the new version include designing for safety, looking at psychological hazards, employee impairment. And this is where I'm talking about a recognition of more of the human element and how it relates to safety issues and security issues, hazard identification and risk assessment, biosafety and biosecurity hazards, and equipment safety. One or two of these clauses would have been in the previous version, but now they've really gone more in depth into the requirements and what it means, what you're looking for as you implement these standards. So in the 35001, as I mentioned, it's really a management system that you're putting in place to complement what you're doing under your 15189 quality management system. And what we're looking at here is if you were to have an eagle eye view over a pyramid and we're to look down at the pyramid in Egypt, what we will be seeing is from the top or the apex looking down and outwards. And they've described what they see as a nucleus in terms of leadership, and within there, the supporting clauses, planning, operation, performance evaluation, improvement, and within that nucleus, the support clause, which we'll go into each of these in a little bit. And there you see really the PDCA cycle that they're talking about that they've used. You plan what it is that you want from your system. You put those things in place. You have to constantly check to make sure what you've put in place, you're meeting your objectives that you planned for. And of course, risk is dynamic, it's changing, it's not static. The risk that we face today, we maybe did not anticipate 3 years ago. Or maybe we did, but we just didn't we didn't do as much planning as we should have to be able to act. But now we have the opportunity. And all of that is underpinned by the support requirements that we're going to see. And these are particularly the operation and support clauses are really what are fleshed out in the 15190 standard. Yes. And so as we go outward, you see leadership is really foundational. The scope of what your biorisk management system is. And of course, the wider context is understanding the organization and its context. We need to have those things as foundation and understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties. And those interested parties are both internal and external, and of course, our stakeholders. Yes. Just want to check in. Are we good so far? Maybe Gail can let me know. Is anyone able to say whether they're with me or not?
I'm with you.
Excellent, Lisa. Dynamic duo.
Still here.
I was taking another call, sorry.
Okay, no problem. Just making sure chat is clear so far. Yes?
Yes, I'm watching the chat. So far, it's clear.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, we're still in early time, so I'll try to, and please, Gail or Monique, at 2:30, please give me a warning signal so that we can move on to the next section in case I'm still lagging behind. So we start with ISO 35001, and again, plan, do, check, act. If we go through these clauses one by one, no, we won't go into specific detail, but clause 1, looking at the scope, really is important because it's saying that you need to identify, assess, control, and monitor the risks associated with hazardous biological materials. That is what this standard is for and about, working with hazardous biological materials. However, it also has a limitation on the scope of this standard, and so it clearly states that it's not for use by laboratories that perform microbiological toxin tests for food or feedstuff, or for the management of risks from the use of genetically modified crops in agriculture. So if you had a lab or a facility, you're working in a laboratory facility where you are doing human or veterinary animal testing, and you also do some of these other tests that are not in the scope, you would just have to note that in implementing this standard, that the activities associated with the microbiological test for food or the use of the genetically modified crops would be outside of this system. There's some very good aspects of it that of course it can benefit from, but the intent is really to know, assess, control, and of course monitor the risks associated with hazardous biological materials. Just mentioning that clause 3 speaks to terms and definitions. There are 46 different terms and definitions that they have put here. Many of them are repeated in the ISO 15190. And clause 4 looks at the context of the organization. If you recall the pyramid, it's really the base and the foundation. There are 4 subclauses under this, and the first one looks at understanding the organization. So knowing what the purpose of the organization is, boundaries, what are the external and internal issues that affect the organization's ability to achieve intended outcomes as it relates to managing the biological risks. Also asks you to look at what are the needs and expectations of interested parties. And an interested party stakeholder, as written in the terms and definitions, is a person or an organization that can affect, be affected by, or perceive themselves to be affected by a decision or activity. So that for me means not only our bosses, not only top management, it means also Visitors means the community that our facility resides in as well. And of course, national regulatory personnel as well. And of course, if we have funding from other, not only one source, whoever is, in terms of us being national labs, the Ministry of Health, but also the developmental partners that we work with to get our work done. So a wide range of interested parties need to be considered, at least listed, noted what would be their needs and expectations in terms of managing the risks that we identify with the biological materials that we work with. Need to look and identify the scope of the biorisk management system. What are some of the key things that you'll be looking to assess and manage and control in terms of what activities are done in your facility, in your institution, not in the institution down the road. This is not meant to be used in really painting every facility with the same brush. There are components that can be used in a national framework and how we monitor biosafety and biosecurity, but the onus will be on the institution, the individual institutions, to determine the scope. And in terms of the biorisk management system, what they expect, oops, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. Apologies for that. There's a little bit that keeps popping up here. Right, the biorisk management: establish, document, implement, and it's biting off part of my slide here. If you give me a moment. Right, so we need to be able to establish, document, implement, communicate, importantly, maintain, and continually improve. Okay, so we need to establish all of those things. So clause 5, really, again, PDCA, and really placing a lot of emphasis on the importance of leadership. Clause 5 speaks to leadership. There are 3 subclauses. 5.1, in terms of leadership and commitment, it's very clear in this standard that top management has to be involved from the beginning, has to be able to commit to the introduction, implementation of a biorisk management system, using the standard and all the requirements as well, because it also has, the resources that are going to be needed to also implement and maintain the system. So it's not only about them giving you the resources, but it's also the understanding from leadership that it's not just for tomorrow, it's not just for, a few months down the road. It's a long-term commitment in how we are working to be able to work safely and securely with the biological materials. And so that's something that has to be discussed very, very early on and continually as well. 5.2 looks at your policy. As we know, every management system starts with a policy, and we all know the hierarchy of the documentation. I have Lisa here as backup in case I say anything incorrectly. We have our policy and then our procedures, our processes and the SOPs, and then all the records at the bottom of that documentation pyramid or triangle. Yeah, so looking at 5.2, what it's saying to us is that the policy has to include how you're protecting the workers, visitors, and the environment. It looks at assessing and prioritizing risks associated with specific activities. It's looking, you have to state that how you're reducing the risks of unintentional or deliberate release of the biological materials, through the implementation of the specific control measures. You must mention about designing and implementing processes to continually evaluate and improve the effectiveness of your system. Ensuring the need for effective biorisk management shall take precedence over all non-health and safety operational requirements. So noting that, and of course, ensuring a policy speaks effectively informing all employees and relevant third parties about the system and communicating individual obligations, because it's from the courier, janitor, the tech, the assistant, all the way up to their laboratory director or your executive director or the Minister of Health or the Minister of National Security, whoever it is. Yes, once they're part of your organization or your institution. 5.3 speaks to the roles, responsibilities, and authorities that are required and should be considered as part of your biorisk management system. And it looks at top management, senior management, your biorisk management committee. If when you do your scope and in your planning, you find that that's something that you need, but again, your scope is based on the context of your organization, so may not be relevant in all instances. The biorisk management advisor, which is also another word for the laboratory safety officer, and scientific management. And of course, additional to that would be what is the role of all employees. I've tried to include where I can some cross-referencing to the ISO 15190 standard. And for this one, it's subclauses 5.3 and 5.5. So when you look at this, you can always cross-reference as well.
Sasha,
Yes.
so we just passed the 2:30 mark.
Great. Thank
Yes.
you. So I would know how to speed up a little bit more, but we're getting there. So clause 6, and as I said, does anyone remember how many clauses I said the ISO 35001 has? Type it in the chat for me. So under clause 6, planning, there are just 2 subclauses. The first one speaks to actions to address risks and opportunities. And reference in 15190 is clause 5, the safety management program, and clause 6, hazard identification and risk assessment. And so what are the things that you're looking for here as documentation? Your risk assessment procedure and your form, how you capture it and how you're actually doing your risk assessment, and performance evaluation of the effectiveness of your control measures that you're going to be putting in place as a result of your risk assessment. Okay, so your engineering controls, your administrative controls, the type of PPE you're wearing, ensuring the procedures that are available and that people are trained, personnel are trained and competent to perform the activity. The second clause, subclause, sorry, looks at biorisk management objectives and planning. And this is now looking at your SMART objectives. And that's why when we talk about the scope, it's part of your planning. You need to ensure that whatever you decide to do, or however small or big your system is going to end up being, that we have, and we know what SMART is, yes? Specific, measurable, accountability, achievable, thanks, R, that's recorded, and time bound, yes? So making sure that those objectives are monitored, communicated, and updated as appropriate. Basically, it means having an action plan where you have to identify your resources are required, having the accountability for implementation, looking at the monitoring evaluation framework, and of course, having a communication plan. Gail, did anyone get it correct? How many clauses in the chat?
Marcia said 8.
Okay, so we're up to clause 8 here. If anybody else would like to hazard a guess, be my guest. So I put clause 7 and clause 8, support and operation, in the same slide. Because if you remember again, the pyramid in that visual, you would see that's really the what and the how you're going to do it. So there are a number of different components to clause 7 on their support, looking at the resources, your worker health program, the competence of your workers, awareness, so the training aspect of it, communication, in terms of making sure that everything is documented. So looking at document control, information security, how you deal with non-employees that visit your institution, personal security of all involved, and they even have a sub-requirement on how you handle the control of suppliers. So these would be persons who are contracted to come into your facility to work on equipment, maintenance personnel. Okay, clause 8, looking at operations, operational planning and control. So this is from even scheduling how work is done, commissioning and decommissioning of the facility or specific components or activities, how that's done, looking at maintenance, control, calibration, physical security, having a biological materials inventory in place. This is something that I've raised before, and it's going to be even more critical in 2021, if not in 2020, with all the samples that we've been handling for SARS-CoV-2. Looking at good microbiological technique, your PPE, decontamination and waste management. So you can see here that this is really the operational aspect, and these relate to multiple clauses in ISO 15190. And so for me, support and operation in 35,001 is basically ISO 15190 from, I would say, about 14 out of the 19 clauses that they have in the 15190 standard. So who is it that you said gave an answer? Sorry, we're at clause 9 now, but we're almost.
Marcia. That was Marcia.
Marcia, but thanks, Marcia. So clause 9 is a good one though. It's a performance evaluation, and looking at 3 components here: monitoring, measurement, analysis, and evaluation. And this is linked to clause 6 or subclause 6.1.4. Can we remember what clause 6 is? Anyone? So clause 6 was planning. Yes, but it also relates to ISO 15190 6.4, looking at risk reduction. And in the 15189 standard, clause 4.14. Does anyone know what 4.14 is? You can put that in the chat for me. And I would like to see if anyone got that. 15189, what is clause 4.14?
Sasha, we also have an answer from Monique in Montserrat, and she said 15 clauses.
Okay, all right. We'll take those bets. Anybody knows what 414 is and 15189? We're looking at performance evaluation here. So then in terms of, and I'll come back to it, in terms of internal audits, this is also not a part of performance evaluation. This relates to subclause 5.7 in the ISO 15190. And in the 15190, Annex B is actually a laboratory safety audit, which is really a lot better than the 2003 version. So I really like it, and I already told Lisa that I want to switch over to this to actually use it this year. And finally, management review as part of the performance evaluation. And we know that this is actually clause 4.15 under the 15189 standard. So you see how closely linked the virus management system is to the 15189 standard, because they're meant to complement each other as well. So we move to clause 10, which is improvement, and we see that PDCA again. So plan, do, check, checking, and acting on what we've checked. Also, this relates quite nicely to the WHO virus management model, which many of you know, the AMP, the assessment, mitigation, and performance. We saw the assessment in terms of the leadership and the planning aspect of it, looking at the risk assessments and doing those things, and operations, support and operations, right? So your mitigation, and then the performance evaluation in terms of all the audits, management review, and of course, improvement. So the general requirement here is that you need to determine opportunities for improvement. And this is linked to clause 9. Does anyone remember what clause 9 is? I'm sure everybody's typing in the chat. I just can't see it. Yeah, so you let me know, Gail, if anybody remembered what clause 9 is. We just spoke about it. So we determine what opportunities for improvement we have. And then we implement the necessary actions to achieve our intended outcomes. Yes, as part of this biorisk management system. Another aspect of it is incident nonconformity and corrective action. And as we know, this will be closely linked in the 15190 standard under clause 19 when we get to it, and definitely under the ISO 15189 standard for quality management system. So clauses 4.9, which speaks to the identification and control of nonconformities, and clause 4.10, which speaks to corrective action. So again, these are really going hand in hand. And if I could say for us, Lisa, I think what we've done is where it's appropriate, we've just really used what we already have in place as our 15189 system to support the biosafety and biosecurity program here at CARFA's labs, which is really the biorisk management system.
Agreed, agreed. But remember, JANAC actually does recognize the 15190.
Right, and so a lot of the accreditation bodies, while the 15190 is really a voluntary standard, many of them include that as part of their checklist that they use when they're looking at the requirements for an accreditation assessment. And I don't know if the 35001 will become a similar type of document as well that they use. So the final part in terms of the continual improvement, I have clauses 411 and 412 here related. If anybody could tell me what 411 and 412 are in the 15189 in the chat.
Sasha?
Yeah, go ahead. Yes, Gail, we have some feedback.
Anselmo and Marcia answering for performance and evaluation.
Yay, performance evaluation was clause 9. Very good. Yes. Great. Thank you to Marcia and Anselmo. You're listening. Very good. Any answers for clauses 411 and 412? Okay, you'll tell me it by the next slide if we get some. So what is this doing? What is the intent? We want to be able to enhance the performance of the system by promoting the culture of continual improvement. And this includes promoting participation of workers in implementing the actions that are required for the progress or for the use of the management system, and of course communicating relevant results to workers and other relevant interested parties about the continual improvement that you're doing in terms of having something happen, how you've responded to it, the assessment, the process, and the recommendations. And of course, it must always be documented. So at this point, just let me know that you hear me properly because the rain started falling quite hard here.
We can hear you clearly, Sasha.
You hear me clearly? I'm actually hardly hearing you. So one moment, because I have to increase my volume here. Okay. So I can pause at this time and ask whether there are any questions. Open the floor for a few questions before we continue.
I haven't seen any questions as yet, so I'm waiting.
Okay, I'm opening the floor as well. If anybody would like to open their mic to ask a question, they can do that at this time as well. Okay, so if any of you are interested in the answers, clause 411 under the ISO 15189 is preventive action, and 4.12 is continual improvement. So those are the corresponding clauses in 15189 to clause 10 for improvement in the ISO 35001. Okay, so Gail, Monique, how are you guys going? Are we okay?
Yes, Sasha, nothing there.
Okay, so I hope it's not too taxing. In terms of what do you guys think that this is something that you can implement or would be willing to try to implement as part of your safety program based on what has been presented? I feel I will take that as a no. Okay, so let's go on to ISO 15190, which is the standard that we're most familiar with. And so the first thing I see is that I have to change the very first point on my slide set here, which is that there are actually 19 clauses, not 18. There are 19 clauses in this new version. Does anyone recall how many clauses there were previously? You can answer that at the end if anyone has used the previous version to let me know. So I'll be making that change before we circulate this, but just to say that there are 19 clauses in the new version of the ISO 15190. There are also 9 annexes, 8 I. They're very well to read for each of them, from how to implement the safety program using the standard to the requirements or the laboratory safety audit checklist. There's information on the use of fire extinguishers and employee impairment, looking at some of those aspects that are newer as well, and also chemical waste management or waste disposal. So really valuable additional information. So in this new version, there have been major changes, as I mentioned before. It's taken a risk-based approach. So there's a lot of additional detail on things like designing for safety, the safety management program, what is required now of you, especially the safety officer, risk assessment, looking at psychological hazards and employee impairment and equipment safety. I wanted to mention clause 3 for the sake of completeness. There are now 30 terms and definitions, and so this is up by 4. I would encourage you to look and see if you can figure out the difference, which are the additional 4 terms and definitions now included at another time. Clause 4 looks at designing for safety. There are 3 subclauses under this. The first one is looking at preliminary considerations when you're designing a laboratory facility. What are some of the key things that you need to do? Who do you need to speak to? What are some of the regulations or approvals that you may need to also consider? What it doesn't really speak to too much is the whole aspect of sustainability. That's why I've actually included here a document that I previously shared which is from Chatham House on their Sustainable Laboratories Initiative, looking at their pre-assessment tool. This tool actually enables persons who are going to be designing a new facility or considering having a new facility or adding an additional suite to their existing facility to work through some of these same questions in terms of what are some of the preliminary considerations and general design requirements that you need to think about and have in place with the eye for sustainability under your local context. So it's not only going to work in North America, it can work in any of our countries, whether it's Belize or Aruba or Bermuda or Guyana, Suriname. So, you know, the group of countries that I call there, you have different challenges, and we all have similar challenges, but there are some things that are more challenging than others that are specific. And so this tool really allows the discussion to happen, prompting you to ask the questions as you go through so that you've made all the considerations. 4.2, and I've put of course, the link there for you. And the second subclause looks at the general design requirements for a lab. There isn't enough time to go through all of these, of course, but the requirements are from A to V. Does anyone know quickly how many requirements that is? 26 letters in the alphabet, A to V. You can put it in the chat, and Monique will tell me who got it correct. 4.3 looks at laboratory security, not just about physical security, but really taking a laboratory security management or program approach, looking at the risk assessment, yes, the physical security measures, an inventory of all hazardous materials. So now the 15190 just does not speak to biological risks or biological materials, but other types of materials that we may be working with in the lab. It also looks at, in terms of 4.3 on the laboratory security, looks at information management and incident and emergency response related specifically to laboratory security. Clause 5, looking at the safety management program, is a big clause. There are 9 subclauses under a safety management program. The first is always general considerations. There are two parts to the management requirements. So they have management requirements and then management responsibilities. And this is directly related to the ISO 35001 clause 5. If anyone can recall what clause 5 was, please put it in the chat. 5.4 looks at the management of staff health, which was there before, but now, you know, a lot more information regarding immunization, how you go about entering persons into your staff surveillance program, what are some of the requirements that you have to do or the background that you have to do instead of just vaccinating everyone, or if you decide to do that, what are the parameters that you would need to ensure that you've considered before doing that. And there's an annex as well that looks at that. Looking at psychological hazards, which wasn't there before, and definitely employee impairment, with Annex Z really outlining what are some of the observations that can help you to determine that there is some impairment of an employee's work and how you can treat with that. So under 5.5, the roles and responsibilities of the laboratory safety officer defined. So many of us, if not all of us on this call, are laboratory safety officers. And you see the list is from A to X. So how many required responsibilities does the ISO 15190 list there? Please, again, put your answer in the chat and we'll look at that. It gives us information on the safety manual. So at a minimum, the standard requires that you have a policy that you look at these following areas: fire prevention, electrical safety, chemical safety, radiation, biological risks, waste disposal. might not seem like a lot, but when we drill down further into the audit different requirements of what of the various aspects of this, you will see that you do need to flesh out quite a bit more, especially since you're taking a risk-based approach. So looking at all the different mitigation measures, etc. And again, Annex A gives you an implementation guide. 5.7 looks at safety program audits and inspection. And again, it's linked back to the clause on performance evaluation. For those who answered correctly the first time, could you remember what clause that was? And again, Annex B is actually, in the standard, actually provides an audit checklist. So performance evaluation was clause 9.
Sasha?
Yes, go ahead.
So when we started, Marcia made a comment and she said that we have been doing some of these and have been implemented. Some have been implemented. That was one. And two, for your question about how many responsibilities the safety officer, I think it is, we have Bashir answered and said 24 responsibilities.
Yay, that's correct. Yes, and I hope that we're saying, and thanks Marcy for that point that you made, because I hope that we're recognizing that we do have, maybe not all, but quite a bit of the requirements already in place. And so I think it's an opportunity for us to look and see what are those elements that are not yet in place, and use it in terms of performance evaluation and continual improvement. So clause 10, that improvement aspect is where I think many of us can benefit from, as well as planning and leadership, if I'm allowed to say that we can improve in those areas. So I think that this is pretty good, that we do know that we're not starting from ground zero. So even though, again, the safety manual gives you just those, I would say, sparse requirements, you look at the next one, safety program audits and inspection, and you look at the responsibilities when you have a chance of the safety officer, that safety manual is going to have a lot more information in it, including how you're going to, what is the approach you're taking for your audit and inspections. Okay, and of course your records now. And clearly it says here, these are to be kept in accordance with ISO 15189. In addition to that, some of the records that we know as safety officers we need to keep: incident records, training records, risk assessment records, equipment records. And this would be the daily, day-to-day use of the equipment, and of course, if anything goes wrong, and waste management records. Now, if you already have your quality management system in place in accordance with 15189, you already have a system for this, and that's completely fine. You don't need to go and put an additional layer on top of that to say, you just need to know where those records are, basically, if someone else has a responsibility for keeping those records. 5.9 looks at the safety training and orientation that should be done with employees and visitors to your facility. So you should have, your program should include what you do when you're introducing new employees, the periodic retraining that's required, needs to be routinely updated, maintaining the training records. And it should also include not only fire prevention and first aid training, but training in the safety protocols for the activities that they're going to be doing in the lab, specific to the area of work. Yes. So it's really meant to also enhance how the employee performs. So clauses 6 to 14, all in one slide. And that's because there's so many things that can happen in each of these clauses that would need to be broken down further. And this is the feedback that I'm looking for from you in terms of whether we can do specific sections. So clause 6 speaks to hazard identification and risk assessment, and there are 4 subclauses, but there are 4 heavy subclauses because previously risk assessment was like a 1 or 2 word two-liner in the previous version and hazard identification, but now it's really broken out again, looking at that risk-based approach that I'm talking about, that we know about. Clause 7, looking at biosafety and biosecurity hazards. There are 8 subclauses here, and Annex E speaks, has additional information. Clause 8 looks at chemical hazards, 7 subclauses and an annex, Annex F, if you want to pull out bits and parts of it. Clause 9 speaks to the different physical hazards we can encounter in a laboratory. There are 8 subclauses. Some of the key ones that I pulled out that are of interest in this new version: ventilation and indoor air quality is dealt with a little bit more. The electrical aspect, radiation, temperature and humidity. And there are others: pressure, and other types of physical hazards that we can encounter. And there's Annex G, which accompanies this particular clause. Clause 10, which speaks to the emergency preparedness and response aspect of what we should have in place. There are 5 subclauses looking at not only your plan, but your training, what type of scenarios that you should plan for, as well as specific detail on how you do spill cleanups as well, and managing waste and employees in terms of their training and their retraining. Clause 11 looks at fire safety. There are 2 subclauses here, and I mentioned Annex H before in terms of the use of the fire extinguishers they have as part of the standard. Clause 12 speaks to laboratory ergonomics, and that is actually quite, if I can look at it here, it's a bit detailed as well, which is good. So it speaks to different things. Employers should be responsible for performing a task analysis to review how work is done. You need to consider ergonomic considerations when purchasing requirements and standards. And anybody who has had to purchase not lab benches, we don't call them lab benches anymore, but lab stools or seating for people working in the lab, we know that the requirements have changed in terms of making sure it's ergonomic and the cost associated with it. Okay, we need to consider that there are various types of body shapes that will be working at the same workstation. So we need to ensure that there's proper workstation design, of course, training persons in how to lift, how to carry, to ensure proper body mechanics. Looking at things even like at some challenges that we may have in the lab, like frequent pipetting, use of optical microscopes for prolonged periods of time. And that's why the task analysis is going to be very important. Use of the biological safety cabinet, even computer stations. Okay. Clause 13 speaks to equipment safety, and there are 10 subclauses looking at different types of equipment, including the autoclave, the microscope, the centrifuge, microtomes, pipettes, and pipeters. So they're different. These different subclauses have specific information. Flow cytometers. Of course, if there's some things that you don't have in your lab, then it would not be applicable. So clause 14 specifically, I wanted to spend a little bit more time on this one because I think this is where many of us start our programs, our safety programs. Safe personnel work practices. Okay, is there a
Sasha?
Yes, go ahead.
So no, I just wanted to let you know we just passed the 3 o'clock mark and we don't have any activity in the chat so far.
Okay then, no problem. Thank you. Maybe at this time I just open up and ask if there are any questions, burning questions.
Well, Sasha, I had a question, but you actually answered it while you were speaking. When you were saying about keeping the records for the equipment and that sort of stuff, because in my lab, even though I am the laboratory safety officer, some of the responsibilities lie with the main
Quality manager.
or the quality manager, and they have the record. So, but you actually answered the question because you were saying that we basically just have to know where to access them. So that's fine with me.
Yes, yes. Lisa wouldn't like to hear this, but it makes our job easier because then, but it also helps us to work better as a team, because when it comes time to do the audits, when I'm doing the safety audit and I'm doing a cross section, some of it would look at equipment, etc., which still needs to be audited under the QMS, right? So that helps quite a bit. That helps us in both ways, but I know where to find it. So that's important, knowing where to find things if they already exist. Only putting a system in place where there is none. Don't reinvent the wheel.
I'm sure
Sasha?
why Sasha said I wouldn't like it, because that's what we do. By the way, I'm in the office right next to her, so she has to be careful what she says. Yes, but that is what we do. We've actually made an agreement where certain things, she keeps the records, right? And I know if I need them when they come to do the assessment, where to get them, and vice versa.
Yes, and we are part of a larger
Sasha?
facility. Yeah, sorry, Monique. Go ahead. You go ahead first.
Marcia is asking, where is the manual available?
Okay, so at the end I'll give you, but you have to purchase it. You can either purchase it directly from the ISO.org site, or you can order through your Bureau of Standards. Okay, so if you don't have a local Bureau of Standards or close Bureau of Standards, the ISO.org, you just put in for the standard, it will come up. It's about 173, what they use Swiss francs. So it works out to be about just under 200 US. And therein lies, of course, making sure that you budget for it and you actually get it as part of your QMS. You can so you have the option of download, or you can ask for the physical copy. Depending on your system, you may want to purchase the one that allows for network availability or access to the document. Yes, as opposed to a single user copy. So just bear that in mind when you're purchasing the standards. And of course, do let me know if purchasing of standards is a way that we can help as well at the end when we talk about next steps. Yeah, so just to go back to the point we were making in terms of record, just to finish up, we're part of a larger facility. So in fact, the waste management records for incineration, removal of, and the chain of custody for that, and then the final record that the waste has been destroyed is actually not kept by me either. It's kept by our health, safety, security officer. But again, I know where to access it, and we have an arrangement where I get the scanned records, and that's kept on our QMS, in our QMS folder for when we need to be audited. So that works well with us. Right, so maybe if we can go forward now, because we're okay, we're almost there to the end. Because does anyone remember how many clauses we have in the ISO 15190 2020 version? It's more than 15. Do we have any answers in the chat?
So both myself and as Bashir said 19 clauses.
Yay, very good. So we're almost there. That's correct. Okay, great. So on the safe personnel work practices, some of the same ones that we're very familiar with, there are no food, drinking, or like substances in the lab. In terms of cosmetics, hair and jewelry, no application or like what that lady is doing in that picture should be done. In terms of, and they even talk about while hand creams may be used, they say oil-based hand creams or lotions can cause deterioration of some glove material. So in sharing information with persons who like to, some of us have dry skin, make sure that they're not using oil-based hand creams or lotions before they put on their gloves. Okay, of course, with long hair, make sure that that's tied back. Men with beards need to observe the same sort of precautions. If it is that they have to use a beard cover, Those are some of the things you have to consider, and it is the responsibility of the lab to ensure those resources are available. Okay, personal property. These are some things that there's a bit on personal electronic devices. Was there before, but not in any great measure. Now there are requirements A to F regarding the use of personal electronic devices, and as you can tell, it's not recommended. Okay, basically you should not be using any type of electronic device, cell phone, personal digital assistants, wireless communication devices. They went on portable music players, radios with headphones. Shall not be used in the technical work area in the following circumstances. I think it's worth reading out. A, when working with hazardous materials of any category, chemical or biological. B, when wearing gloves or other personal PPE with the exception of a lab coat. C, while performing in laboratory samples, data or process that can affect testing outcomes. D, when in an area in which they might distract or interrupt others. E, when in an area in which accidental release of protected health information could occur. And F, if they interfere with an employee's ability to detect potential hazards, such as hearing an alarm or an approaching obstacle. And that's particularly, if persons have headphones in as well, or you're on the phone and walking around. And I just want to say E, which talks to the accidental release of protected health information. I mean, that could be said for all labs at any point in time, whether it's taking a picture, an unsolicited picture of someone doing work, or capturing a request form or any type of information, even in the background. Yes, or hearing if others are speaking. So that's something that is worth reviewing. And all personal electronic devices should be protected from laboratory hazards and possible contamination, right? Because when we go home to our families, we're taking whatever is stuck on the screen, and we know that little ones particularly like to interfere. Of course, no festive decorations in the lab, but of course in administrative areas that might be good. We're coming up on Christmas and we need something positive for 2020. Looking at hand hygiene, we wanted to highlight 14.4.6F. Artificial fingernails or extenders shall not be worn if duties include direct contact with patients. Worth speaking about if you're working in a medical lab in a hospital facility, because I know that even though you have phlebotomists, and this would of course relate directly to the phlebotomist, some persons taking samples. Sometimes we're also called upon to take samples. So it means everybody should take note of that. Of course, we know we don't do any mouth pipetting, and in terms of handling sharps and not overfilling the containers, of course, having the proper receptacles, where possible, reduce the use of sharps for your procedures. Clause 15 looks at personal protective equipment. There's 7. Sorry, go ahead.
Before you go,
Yes.
So on the 14.4, no use of personal devices in the laboratory. Tell me how we're going to get that done, because this has become such a nightmare and I really don't know where to start with it.
You have to start with exactly what it says in the standard. Say, it's not Gail Trotman telling you, this is what it is saying, if we want to be able to have, meet our requirements as well. And it affects all of us, because at one point or the other, and it is possible that while the standard clearly says we're not to use a phone or an electronic device, you can also, in your safety manual or in your procedure, if you choose to have a procedure relating to this, you can define when it is acceptable to use an electronic device, under what circumstances. Because there might be times when the only way to reach someone if it's a very important caller. So it might be to take a cellular phone to them. Or no, a lot of us are going to be having our accreditation assessments. It may mean us using an electronic device to take into the lab to show the person on the other side what's taking place. So, you know, we have to really weigh the risk as well in terms of what we're doing. So, don't really answer your question, but obviously we have a starting point, and it's something that can probably be done again a little bit more detail, and everyone is dealing with it. Also, not only the cell phones, but I think the music, putting the headphones in and working in the lab is something that I guess younger folk are doing now. And again, it talks about not interfere, shouldn't be interfering with an employee's ability to detect potential hazards. If I walk in and you don't even know that I'm right behind you, you know, that means that you're clearly not aware of potential hazards outside what you're doing. And of course,
Sasha, I was just wondering though, as you said that, I remember, yes, I walked into a staff member and they were listening to music, not headphones, right? But what about when you're working, as you said, hearing, like we have some biosafety cabinets that are exceedingly loud.
yes.
And really, when you're working under that, you can't hear.
Correct.
So how does the standard address that?
Right. So that would, in fact, that's something that you would interfere with an employee's ability to detect potential hazards, including hearing an alarm or an approaching obstacle. So, and as you can see, fellow colleagues, we are identifying an opportunity for improvement even in our own lab as we go through this. That's why it's important to share this information and what's required in the standard as well. Because I would say that this is something that we don't recommend to be listening to music, especially when you're working with equipment that's making loud, you know, making a bit of noise as well. It reduces your ability to react to things. Yeah. So that's something for us to take into consideration. Okay, so PPE, 7 subclauses, looks at, you know, PPE or protective clothing both inside the lab and outside of the laboratory as well, especially for personnel that may need to attend to patients or other stakeholders off-site. What is key here is it says home laundering is not an acceptable practice. I know that this is something that has traditionally been done. You put your lab coat in a plastic bag and you take it home. No, the standard is now saying it is not an acceptable practice. The onus is on the laboratory, on the facility to ensure that there are appropriate mechanisms in place to launder, particularly the lab coats. Okay. Looking at face and body protection, there's the subclause on the use of gloves. So selection, the criteria for how you select gloves in terms of the requirements, also for users, training, proper use of gloves, do's and don'ts of gloves, and of course, proper disposal. 15.6 looks at footwear. And I wanted to note that the standard says footwear is to cover the foot to include the heel, toes, and instep. It can be leather or synthetic fluid impermeable footwear. That is what is recommended. I know that's another thing that ballerina shoes and so on, ladies, yes, talking to us, being used in the lab. It can be said that maybe in your lab you don't have the same type of hazards, particular physical hazards, but these need to be taken into context as well. Okay. Respiratory protection, it looks here at the types of respiratory protection that you may need depending on the type of activity that's being conducted. And I think in 2020, this has become very relevant. The need for individual fit testing on respirators, workplace monitoring, medical evaluation, and user training, not only initially, but periodically, to ensure that persons are using the respirators that they've been fitted for correctly and for the activities for which it has been identified for use. Clause 16 looks at the transport of samples and hazardous materials. I encourage you to put in the chat what are some of the engineering controls that you could use to transport samples or other hazardous materials within the facility. Additionally, we need procedures for how we transfer samples within the facility. Note that samples should be transported in approved, inherently safe, leak-proof containers, while the transfer samples, cultures, and other biological materials between the lab and other facilities shall ensure the integrity of the sample and the safety for the carrier, the general public, and the receiving laboratory. While this clause does not specifically speak to training, this is covered under clause 5.9.1b. It speaks specifically to training. This is the clause for the safety training and orientation of staff. It speaks about transport. So you have to ensure that persons are trained. And recall that we know when we're transporting samples from our lab to a reference or referral lab, we use the triple package way of preparing our samples, and also ensuring training and where appropriate the certification of persons depending on the category as well, the category A or category B type of samples. Okay, so did anyone give any examples of engineering controls in the chat?
Not as yet.
Okay, so some engineering controls would be like what? Your trolleys, the carrier buckets, if you have large bottles of chemicals, how you transfer those. Also, you know, the use of Tupperware from one point of the lab to another, particularly with samples. So clauses 17 to 19. Clause 17 speaks to waste disposal. There are 4 subclauses, looks at hazardous waste, non-hazardous waste, and the records that are required. And bear in mind that on a 5.8.3 also spoke about the need to have these types of records. Clause 18 speaks to housekeeping practices. It talks not only about persons who are part of the lab that perform the on-the-bench type of cleaning and on a regular basis, making sure there's no clutter, but also the janitorial services and any external service providers that do this. And finally, clause 19 speaks to incidents, injury, accidents, and occupational illnesses. Here, what the standard speaks about is promoting a safe workplace environment by facilitating a blameless reporting culture. Do you recall where this was said before? We mentioned this when we spoke about this in ISO 35001 under improvement as well. Employees have a responsibility to report unsafe working conditions and any accident or incident involving any of the hazards. Okay, reports are required, and they list criteria A to E of what your report should include and the process of doing the report, and these should be reviewed by senior management. And we note that this is part of the laboratory safety management program. So subclause 5.5 speaks to this need to assess these incidents and reports as opportunities for improvement, and where it's applicable, to see it as a need for changes to policy, process, or procedures. Okay, so that's what wraps up the ISO 15190 standard in a nutshell.